The promise of evolutionary medicine is great. There are opportunities to better understand why we get sick and opportunities to accelerate innovation to create more effective strategies for countering, preventing, treating the most impactful diseases of our time.
Hello. Welcome to this Frontiers Forum deep dive session. I'm Lee Baker, the Editorial Adviser at Frontiers in Science, Frontiers' flagship multidisciplinary open access journal. Today's deep dive session focuses on this article that we published early this year, entitled The Future of Evolutionary Medicine, Sparking Innovation in Biomedicine and Public Health. It's authored by an interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary author panel from around the world, and it explores various aspects of evolutionary medicine and proposes a research agenda to try to leverage and capitalize on its potential to address some of the key health challenges of the 21st century. Here is the article in its hub of content. This is the lead article. You can see we also complement it with a lay explainer, which itself has infographics and video. There are expert insights, including an editorial by Professor Mark Hansen and viewpoint articles by the peer reviewers and a policy outlook and an interview with the authors. So this is the agenda for today. Professor Barbara Natterson-Horowitz is going to open, setting the scene on a research agenda for biomedical innovation through evolutionary medicine. And then a founding figure in this field, Randy Nesse, is going to present on the future, his perspective on the future of evolutionary medicine. Next, there'll be a panel discussion with Professor Daniel Blumstein, together with Barbara and Randolph, and also Dr. Athena Actipis, Dr. Molly Fox, and Professor Bernie Crespi. So to get us underway, first of all, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Barbara Natterson-Horowitz. Barbara Natterson-Horowitz is a cardiologist and evolutionary biologist. She has dual posts both at Harvard University and University of California, Los Angeles. She has taken her research to a very wide audience, investigating the insights of the natural world on disease processes and health and well-being, particularly through two books, Zoobiquity and Wildhood, which you may well have already heard of. So it's a great pleasure to introduce and ask Barbara, please take the floor. It's yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Lee. Thank you to Frontiers, to my co-authors on the paper, to our keynote speaker, and to those of you who have gathered today to learn with us. So exactly, literally 50 years ago, Theodosius Dobzhansky wrote, "Nothing in biology makes sense outside the light of evolution." And these words, like so many truisms, are at once profound and obvious. Obvious because evolutionary pressures have shaped the form and function of every characteristic of every species of life on Earth. Profound because once this reality is fully understood, it transforms our understanding of one of the most important of all biological concerns, our health. So nothing in biology makes sense outside the light of evolution. If that is the case, then nothing in cardiology, nothing in pediatrics, psychiatry, or any other field of medicine makes sense outside the light of evolution. And the field of evolutionary medicine is leveraging this reality to improve our understanding of the causes of disease and to accelerate innovations to treat and prevent them. Evolutionary medicine is an approach to understanding and solving health challenges that integrates a diversity of lenses and tools from a growing range of biomedical investigational fields. And this integration can reveal insights that have eluded biomedical approaches lacking evolutionary perspectives. Some examples of these insights are an increased understanding of how evolutionary histories and selective pressures have shaped modern phenotypes of vulnerability to disease. They include increased recognition of how ongoing evolutionary processes influence how our bodies resist or succumb to infections, to cancers, and to other diseases. They include identifying evolved adaptations in other species that may confer a level of resistance to pathophysiologic challenges for which our species remains highly vulnerable. And on the slide you see here is one of the images from our paper, in which we have about a dozen examples of non-human animals who have evolved adaptations that appear to confer some degree of resistance to high-impact pathophysiology in our species. So this approach of considering evolution as a kind of problem-solving process, hyper-iterative process, is one component of this broad field of evolutionary medicine. For our Frontiers in Science paper, we first asked our colleagues from around the world to imagine a future in which evolutionary medicine is used to achieve its tremendous and as yet unrealized potential for improving human health and well-being. We then reviewed several promising areas of biomedical research in which evolutionary approaches are positioned to transform, and we found them across an impressively wide range of concerns, from accelerating innovation countering antimicrobial and phage therapy resistance to developing public health strategies informed and thereby strengthened by life history theory. Finally, we proposed a research agenda to extend this work. Specifically, we have called for systematic mapping to identify animal model systems for disease vulnerability, resistance, and counter-resistance that could lead to novel clinical treatments. We have called for focused study and increasing effort and resources toward understanding how evolutionary dynamics can guide the development of novel therapeutic approaches that target the development of resistance, again, in cancer or in antimicrobial resistance. In other words, using evolutionary thinking and tools to target the emergence of resistance. We called for increased focus on understanding how many modern human diseases, including obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and even some psychiatric diseases, result from mismatches between the ecologies in which these processes evolved, these vulnerabilities evolved, and the modern environments in which we live. And these insights, including insights related to beyond mismatch, the importance of considering life history evolution, these insights can have important implications for not only individual patients, but also public health policy and disease prevention efforts. For example, we are calling for increased focus on how effective evolutionarily informed management of COVID-19 and future zoonotic outbreaks, how it can be strengthened by applying evolutionary theories to understand and model infection dynamics and to create models of more accurate and informative models of future scenarios. And finally, we have called for an increased focus on understanding how evolutionary principles can be used to address aspects of human behavior that may impede biomedical innovation and public health, such as vaccine hesitancy. The promise of evolutionary medicine is great. There are opportunities to better understand why we get sick and opportunities to accelerate innovation to create more effective strategies for countering, preventing, treating the most impactful diseases of our time. I want to again thank Frontiers and the authors on the paper. And now I want to, it is a privilege to introduce our invited keynote speaker, Professor Randolph Nesse, who is one of the fathers of our field. Randy Nesse is a pioneering figure. He is a visionary truly in the world of evolutionary medicine. Perhaps more than any other single individual, Randy's contributions have been critical for our emerging field. He has been an architect of the field, helping to build not only a strong foundation, a strong scientific foundation, but also to construct a tent wide enough to welcome a diversity of disciplines from medicine, anthropology, and public health and more into our community. Randy's work with George Williams inspired many to expand explanations of disease from descriptions of why and how mechanisms fail in some individuals to evolutionarily informed explanations for traits that leave all individuals within a species vulnerable to disease. Their collaborations culminated in the landmark book, Why We Get Sick, widely regarded as a transformative and foundational text for the field. After 40 years as a professor of psychiatry and psychology at the University of Michigan, Randy moved to Arizona State University to start a new center for evolution in medicine, and our society, the International Society for Evolution Medicine and Public Health. His focus now is returning to his original mission of trying to provide a solid scientific foundation for evolutionary psychiatry. His book, Good Reasons for Bad Feelings, and his recent article, Evolutionary Psychiatry, advance his goal of providing psychiatry with its missing foundation in evolutionary biology. Randy is a tireless champion of the field. He is an innovator, and he is a friend. I cannot think of any better scholar in the world to kick off today's deep dive event than today's keynote speaker, Professor Randy Nesse. Today, Dr. Nesse will speak on the benefits of integrating evolutionary medicine into medical practice to better understand, treat, and prevent the major diseases of our time.
Thank you so much, Barb. And it's so wonderful to be here. Thanks to Lee and Frontiers and everybody for making this possible. I'll try to live up to that fabulous introduction, but emphasize that I'm one of many, many people who have gotten this all going. And it's wonderful to see how fast it's all developing. I'm going to be inspired today by Bernie Crespi's article. He wrote in the Frontiers of Science Viewpoint, I used to think that the future of evolutionary medicine was unconditionally bright. Now, however, for me, as for the immortal Yogi Berra, the future ain't what it used to be. And he has two poles where he sees we could go. One is the hope that evolution gets integrated so thoroughly into medicine that it's not needed anymore, just like we don't need genetic medicine or anatomic medicine. But he also has the fear that evolutionary medicine is going to fade away because too few follow the path of the first generation researchers. And I'm going to argue, and Bernie will have comments on this later, I hope, that it's not either of these extremes, but it is, I'm not going to talk about where I want to see the field go. I'll talk a little about that, but mostly I'm going to talk about where I think it will go, irrespective of the efforts of all of us. First, more wisdom from the famous philosopher, you know who I'm talking about. It's hard to make predictions, he says, especially about the future. Thanks so much to Yogi Berra. And thanks also to the authors of this article. I'm not going to try to summarize that article and all of the advances described in there. Go to the article, read it, enjoy it, read it twice or three times. If you assign it to your class, give them a whole week to summarize it. But I'm not going to talk even about the advances described in that article. I'm going to try to anticipate where is evolutionary medicine headed. I'm going to take a step back from my usual talks about encouraging everybody to go certain directions, to just say, how do fields evolve? And I think they evolve in response to academic ecosystems and the selection forces in those ecosystems, where both researchers and organizations go to where the resources are. And this will shift evolutionary medicine it already has, not necessarily in a way that maximizes benefits to the field. So the prediction from this thesis is that growth will be fastest in areas with practical applications. And I must say that's a good thing. And also tractable questions. This means building on established population genetics. And ones that use established expensive methods. At the universities I've been at, they really like big projects with lots of assistants because the overhead is really nice for deans. And of course, you need funding to make all this possible. And underrated, but very important for growth of a field, is recently created student projects. Barbara, for instance, has dozens of students at Harvard, all doing posters and papers based on, it's marvelous the way her research focus lends itself to bringing young people into the fold and showing them how to develop into scientists. So as you already mentioned, new interest came up in the 1990s for evolution in medicine. And the key to it was recognizing that traits that make organisms vulnerable to disease need evolutionary explanations. This seems kind of odd if you think about it. We think about natural selection shaping things that work well, and we're suggesting that natural selection also can be used to explain why things don't work very well. Things like wisdom teeth and the appendix, that narrow birth canal, and the back that causes pain for so many of us. Here's something a lot of junior people do right off the bat. They say, oh, things have evolutionary explanations. There must be an evolutionary explanation for a disease. Let's look at how it gives an advantage. Please don't do that. Our field is pretty successful in avoiding that kind of thing, but it's a very tempting mistake. So this is a fundamentally new question. The usual question in medicine is to figure out why this individual got sick. That's about genetic variations, mechanisms, and environmental variations. The new question is, why did natural selection leave us all vulnerable? This is a giant shift in perspective. It's the difference between a mechanic's description of broken parts and an engineer's perspective on why the thing was designed this way in the first place that left it vulnerable. These are the 6 categories that George Williams and I put in their 1994 book, and they've held up pretty well. I have a whole new paper describing how to elaborate these more specifically, but there's some things natural selection just can't do, constraints. There's mismatch with environments, arms races with things that are evolving much faster than natural selection can keep up. Probably the most important deep one is that the whole system is shaped to maximize reproduction, even at the expense of robustness and health. Then there are lots of trade-offs that compromise health. And finally, there are defenses that are expensive and costly and painful. Notice in red, it says individual variations on the left. This is just to highlight that that's where almost all medical research is. How is this person different in ways that made them sick? But it's a tiny part of a large field that is still just getting going. This is also something new. Notice that the left-hand side here refers to things natural selection just can't do. And on the right-hand side are things that natural selection does very well indeed that still leave us vulnerable to disease. Even if there were no mutations or genetic drift or mismatch, we would still get sick because natural selection has not shaped us to maximize health, longevity, or happiness, sadly. Again, this big shift in perspective turns out to be, in retrospect, only the smallest part of what evolution offers to medicine. And I think George Williams and I didn't recognize that. We thought our new idea was going to, no, it turns out that there are all kinds of other people who are doing wonderful things for ages. And in particular, Darwin made 2 discoveries, which I wasn't aware of back then. One was the unity of all life, and also was the fact of why traits are well suited to their functions. One is phylogeny, one's adaptation, and it turns out that this defines 2 quite separate fields within evolutionary medicine. They ask different questions. One is phylogenomics, and there's a Society for Molecular Biology and Evolution and a wonderful journal, Molecular Biology and Evolution, for the people who work in that area. Then for people who study function and fitness, there's the International Society for Evolution Medicine and Public Health and the journal Evolution Medicine and Public Health. I wish these were better connected, but I must say they're quite separate, and there are huge opportunities to link them. When I arrived at Arizona State University, I was very surprised to learn they already had an evolution and medicine program, one run by the wonderful Sudhir Kumar. And there's yet so much to be done to connect these 2 fields. And I'm hoping bridges will be built. And one person I hope will do that with her new genomic methods and cross-species analyses is Barbara and her colleagues, but many other people I hope will be engaged in this as well. Steve Stearns and I wrote an article a while back that provides some data. That little graph on the right, that illustration by Roswell and Bergstrom, they looked at citation patterns to show what went where. And it turns out that lots of citations from medicine to molecular and cellular, some from ecology and evolution, but that little blue line that sweeps down from the top right red dot to the bottom one, that's the entire contribution of ecology and evolution to medicine. Very thin, so ready to be developed further. And I should say further that there wouldn't be any field of evolutionary medicine if it wasn't for Steve Stearns. He organized several conferences that got people together and defined the field and started expanding it beyond that narrow focus that George Williams and I proposed. In that same paper, we had a table that I keep above my desk, pointing out that there are 2 kinds of evolutionary questions, the ones about phylogeny we've just talked about, and the ones about adaptive significance, and at least 5 different levels: human traits, human genes, pathogen traits, pathogen genes, and cell lines. Each of these comprises a different area of research. And if you help your students and yourself figure out which area an article or research project is in, it helps a whole lot in making sense of things. My original interest was here, and a lot of people share that interest, but it turns out that the progress in the field has been mostly in these bottom parts. It's big advances from studies of genes, cells, and pathogens, especially small things that evolve fast. The questions are more tractable, the methods are better developed, and they're more useful. Just to reiterate some of the giant accomplishments of evolutionary medicine, some of which we didn't anticipate at all: new methods for treating cancer, new strategies for preventing antibiotic resistance, new ways of tracing the origins of infections, and new population genetic methods to analyze selection, drift, and the like. I'm going to go through quick slides just so that people who don't already know about evolutionary medicine realize the opportunities here. And for anybody who's interested in that, please join the International Society for Evolutionary Medicine and Public Health. You can get on a free newsletter, if nothing else. It'll keep you up with opportunities in the field. Lopeto's paradox, Josh Schiffman has worked on this, also Tina Actipis and Carl O'Malley who worked on this, showing that elephants get less cancer than mice, even though they have so many more cells, because natural selection has created powerful mechanisms to prevent cancer in very large animals. That's led to very practical advances, including by Robert Gatenby at the Moffitt Cancer Institute in Florida, showing that lower doses of cancer chemotherapy can give better responses because of dealing with the mathematical models that assess the ecology in which tumor cells live. Athena Actipis's book takes basic evolutionary theory of cooperation and competition and uses it to try to understand the competition and cooperation between different cancer cells. Andrew Reed has written for years with mathematical models about, is it really necessary to take every pill in the antibiotic bottle? And his conclusion is that actually that might speed development of antibiotic resistance instead of preventing it. And finally, the infectious disease community has recognized this is correct, but the articles in the medical journals don't cite any of the articles he and others wrote in basic biology journals. The gulf between the areas is gigantic. However, we are doing progress. He collaborates with an infectious disease specialist at the University of Michigan and Robert Woods, and they together have taken individual patients and individual mathematical models of the current patient state and antibiotic resistant state and try to figure out which drugs will be good for this person in this circumstance. That's real personalized medicine. Here's bilirubin, one of my favorites. Why does the body make bilirubin? It's toxic. It's in how to get out of the body. The body makes energy to use it. Turns out it's a fine antioxidant, a substance of discovery made really by a psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins. And it turns out now that people are starting to recognize that bilirubin might in fact treat a variety of illnesses. And those people with the syndrome that leaves them with slightly high bilirubin have about half as many heart attacks as other people. These kinds of insights are just fundamental for people studying liver disease, but usually unknown to them still. Alzheimer's disease is a great plague of our time, that along with depression, and everybody has been looking at beta amyloid as if it's just a toxic byproduct that's hanging around there for no reason. Natural selection doesn't do things like that. Beta amyloid exists because it's a potent antimicrobial. Those little orange dots are the beta amyloid coalescing around Salmonella typhi injected into a mouse brain. And then there's tracing origins of different diseases. One of the most dramatic and influential is by Mike Worobey, looking at the different origins of COVID in Wuhan, showing that it clusters around the market, not around the Institute of Virology. And on the left-hand side, we can now tell about the relationship between bats and pangolins and how it spreads in people. These kinds of things were not possible just 10 to 15 years ago, and it's just spectacularly important as well as fascinating. Ann Stone at Arizona State University was part of the group that looked at why tuberculosis got to the New World before European explorers. It turns out it was brought there by seals, a finding that can be documented by using these phylogenomic studies on ancient DNA, methods that were not even dreamed about just a decade or two ago. And even more recently, a group in Germany has been able to show the exact origins and transmission sites of different strains of Yersinia pestis, the cause of plague. They've been digging up bodies and looking at the DNA sequence of the plague bacillus. I mean, it's just incredible how useful and interesting this all is. Anthropological studies need to be emphasized much more. This is one wonderful group that studies at Chamonix in Bolivia. And the red circle is the degree of calcification in most modern populations in technological societies by age 75, about 51%. But in the Chamonix, it's more like 8%. Completely different trajectories, not only for their coronary artery calcification, but for blood pressure. This is the key to understanding epidemics of modern life, and we need lots more data like that. But this brings us to other areas that are very promising but neglected. I'd love to see huge investments in disease rates for foraging groups before that opportunity is gone. Comparative physiology and genomics of the sort that Barb has been advocating would be wonderful. Mental disorders is really growing fast now. It's been 40 years since my original publication on evolution and psychiatry. And now there's a big group in the UK with 3,000 members in the Evolutionary Psychiatry Special Interest Group in the Royal College of Psychiatry. Lots to be done, especially on the right-hand side. Diametric diseases and trade-offs. Bernie Crespi's been instrumental in advancing this. And there's such huge opportunities there, really not recognized by very many people. And the whole business of fundamental science on selfish elements and how natural selection has shaped mechanisms to control them. My goodness, that's all ripe and ready to go. And not advanced the way we should. My own current interest is trying to understand control systems. And it finally dawned on me, the body doesn't just have a dozen control systems to control, temperature and pH and blood oxygen. It has tens of thousands of control systems for the regulation of each gene and the reproduction of every cell and the release of every hormone and neurotransmitter. And every one of them is subject to a trade-off of maximal gain versus maximal stability. This is ready to be explored, but most diseases are problems with control system dysregulation. And finally, we come to organic complexity and wrenching transitions. I mean, these bodily systems, when you do a huge transition, like from on all fours to bipedality, it's really hard, even with a lot of time, to fix everything that goes wrong after that kind of a transition. After we began standing upright, childbirth became more problematic, arthritis became a problem, varicose veins and hernias. These are new problems, and they haven't been fixed yet, even after a couple of million years. I think it's an intrinsic problem. And this goes back to Barbara mentioning that animals often demonstrate genetic and other evidence of selection to prevent diseases, especially those, I would say, after these wrenching transitions. And for my work in psychiatry, there's been speculation for decades about language or cognition having something to do with our vulnerability to schizophrenia. But now, incredibly, there's a way of testing that kind of thing. This is an article by Liu that came out in Frontiers in Genetics in 2019, showing that ancestral alleles for schizophrenia are being selected against the ones that increase the risk. But new derived alleles turn out to be decreasing the risk. That is, their selection for alleles that compensate for the risks. And I think it's all because of systems falling apart, because they're so damn complex that when you do a massive change, like entering into the social cognitive niche, a lot of things fall apart and need to be fixed up. This is a current medical mystery. I think a lot of our expectations about what we're going to find and looking for the causes of disease are not working out. I mean, just 20 years ago, we were pretty sure we'd find common alleles causing most diseases. It's not true. Most diseases are caused by thousands of alleles with teensy effects of less than 1%. And many disorders have multiple causes. It's not genes or environment, it's all kinds of things altogether. And then in psychiatry, we're all very certain that we'd have new diagnostic categories by now based on specific brain abnormalities. We haven't found specific brain abnormalities for anything except perhaps for Alzheimer's disease and Huntington's disease. Our model is not right. The core schema is wrong. We've been using a machine model that encourages searches for broken parts and explanations that don't exist. Is there a way of using an evolutionary way of thinking to move forward past that? I think there is, but first of all, we need to acknowledge that we've been vastly simplistic. We've been hoping it would all be like a Modigliani with nice little boxes, all distinct with lines between them. Here's real life. This is what we really get, is a Jackson Pollock. There is structure in there, but oh, it's so hard to figure out what it is. So this is an error, I would say. The body as machine metaphor grossly simplifies and distorts our schemas and misleads us, leading to huge searches for things that are not productive in medical research. And the solution is recognizing these fundamental differences between organic and design systems. Bodily systems don't have any such thing as a super normal blueprint. They just have genes. Trade-offs in the body all maximize reproductive success. Those in machines maximize profit and other things. And especially the control systems, 10,000 in a body at least. A machine has just a few maximum. Here's just a single example from an hour lecture. This is a clotting cascade. Anybody who's been to medical school has memorized that several times and forgotten it. It's useful. If you want to figure out if a person has a factor 9 deficiency and what happens, you need to know this, but it's not real. This is a reality of how that system actually works with all of those molecules interacting with all of the others. But that's not something you can write exam questions on, and it's not as useful in the clinic. So we just deceive ourselves into imagining it's too simple. Michael Hochberg, who I hope will be with us talking about this, has pointed out that we need to integrate complexity into our studies, and not just the usual mathematical models of complexity that try to simplify complexity and show how complexity comes from simple systems. We need to really acknowledge the differences between machines and organic complexity. Huge new opportunity to bring evolutionary thinking in, but it has a problem, has two problems, really. The first problem is that human minds hate this. We want simplicity. It's why we love science, because it simplifies. And here in this case, reality is not. And teachers, they also need simple exam questions. You can't teach that Jackson Pollock. This is something I think we need other leaders like Jay Labov, for instance, our head chair of our education committee in the International Society for Evolutionary Medicine and Public Health, has a lot to say about how do we help teachers to figure out how you can teach this kind of complexity. Global challenges we all face as we develop the field further. First is none of us can know enough. We need collaborators, and preferably sympathetic collaborators, because a lot of disciplines reject outsiders and say, well, if you can't, calculate the coalescent, you shouldn't be even talking about this. Really? The founders of evolutionary medicine, I think all were benefiting from really generous contributions. I mean, George Williams put up with me when I didn't know much of anything, and it turned out to be a very productive, useful thing. Likewise, John Maynard Smith and Bill Hamilton and Dick Alexander were so inspirational, and they were eager to talk with doctors, even if we didn't know much. And it's gone the other way as well. Innovations threaten established schemas is another challenge. But I think in contrast to Bernie Crespi's little bit of pessimism there, I think evolutionary medicine is already thriving, and you can see it in the paper. And it's already good that institutional allocation of resources focuses on finding cures. We all want cures, not only for heart disease and Alzheimer's, but for so many other things, which are coming, I think, from an evolutionary perspective. Also, there are a lot of people who are just damn curious, and they go ahead with their work, even though their dean tells them to go get new drug company grants or whatever. I think the desire to understand things is just so deep, not just in our field, but in humans in general, and it will persevere no matter what. And the best scientists, I think, are welcoming interested ignoramuses and going the other direction. Many in medicine have a lot to contribute. The opportunities are huge. I'm going to end with Bernie Crespi's slide here, where he shows that we need collaborations of at least 3 different kinds to move this forward, between theorists and empiricists, between medical biologists and doctors, and between doctors and evolution types and industry. We're ready to do this. I'm interested to hear what he and everyone else has to say about this. I still look forward to hearing all of that, and thank everybody for the opportunity. Over back to Lee. Thanks so much for making this possible.
Thank you, Randy, for a beautiful presentation, for sharing your own vision for the future of evolutionary medicine, but also the challenges. And I hope we're going to kick around some of those issues and many more, I expect, in the panel discussion. This is going to be chaired by Professor Daniel Blumstein from the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. Dan co-founded and co-directs UCLA's evolutionary medicine program together with Barbara. He's authored over 500 scientific papers and a number of books, including The Nature of Fear, Survival Lessons from the Wild. Together with Barbara, he led the development of the Frontiers in Science article that we've been talking about so far. So Dan's going to chair the discussion. He's going to be joined by Barbara and also by Randy, and also by two more authors of the Frontiers in Science paper. That's Dr. Athena Actipis, who's Associate Professor, Department of Psychology at Arizona State University, and co-director of the Cooperation Science Network and the Human Generosity Project. Athena studies cooperation across systems, from the breakdown in multicellular cooperation in cancer to human sharing. She's the founder of Zombified Media, a host of the podcast Zombified, author of The Cheating Cell, How Evolution Helps Us Understand and Treat Cancer, which Randy alluded to, and also a forthcoming book, A Field Guide to the Apocalypse, a mostly serious guide to surviving our wild times. Also, Dr. Molly Fox, who's the founder and principal investigator at UCLA's Biological Anthropology of Motherhood Lab. Molly studies maternal and grandmaternal transgenerational transmission of genes, phenotypes, life history traits, and disease risks. And lastly, we also welcome Professor Bernie Crispy, Professor of Evolutionary Biology at the Department of Biological Sciences, Simon Fraser University, Burnaby in Canada. Bernie's lab uses genetic, ecological, and phylogenetic approaches to study evolutionary biology of human diseases, including endometriosis, polycystic ovary syndrome, placental disorders, cancer, autism, and schizophrenia. As Randy again alluded to, Bernard contributed a viewpoint article to the Frontiers in Science Evolutionary Medicine Hub after peer reviewing the lead article. So it's a pleasure to introduce and welcome you all. And Dan, over to you.
Thanks for having us, and thank you for joining us. Randy, great overview. Early in your presentation, you spoke about how the new question that evolutionary medicine continues to raise is, why does natural selection lead us to vulnerability to disease? And you pointed out that certain traits and genes show ongoing promise for their adaptive significance. Where should research be focusing on evolutionary reasons for vulnerability? Put another way, what would you like to see achieved over the next 10 years in this area, this key area?
So, there's such an opportunity. Thanks for that question, Dan. And there's such a huge opportunity to start thinking about the body in terms of the trade-offs involved in systems that leave us vulnerable to disease. And I'm going to ask Bernie Crespi to address this after me, because that's his business and he's inspired a lot of my thinking about this area. We're just not thinking that way very much now. We're just assuming it's broken parts without recognizing an engineering perspective about why those systems are vulnerable to failure. So if we could analyze every single disease, at least with all 6 of the kinds of explanation that I propose, but in particular, not just why natural selection can't do it better, but why natural selection has maximized reproductive success in gene transmission at the expense of robustness and health, I think that would just open up all kinds of new advances in evolutionary medicine.
Bernie, do you want to comment on that since Randy asked you?
I completely agree with Randy that trade-offs at all levels, from genes to the mind, are absolutely fundamental to progress in the field. And they're also an area where people don't naturally go when they're thinking about medical issues. People like to think about health versus non-health and optimization. But the perspective that you don't get anything for free, if something goes up, something goes down, well, that those types of systems are pervasive in the human body, and we need to recognize how they work. Pleiotropic effects, antagonistic pleiotropy is everywhere. It's not intuitive. It's not obvious, and it needs to be focused on in more detail.
So the Pollock image is both inspiring and terrifying in its complexity. And I think that the field is moving more towards and recognizing the complexities of these, and that, there have been calls for systems thinking. But what's what's necessary to promote this thinking? And this is a question to everybody. And what can we do in concrete ways to make concrete advances? What are the low-hanging fruit systems that we can approach with this new approach?
Well, I would just say that I think the question you're asking is exactly right for the moment in which we exist, because there now is, it's not an exaggeration to call it an explosion of publicly available bioinformatic platforms that can allow us to begin to take the thicket of branches from that tangled bank that the Pollock image sort of reminds us of, that tangled bank, and to these platforms show the promise of being able to let us begin to untangle these, to sort of disentangle these pathways. Now, it's a massive project, but I do think that we are at a moment between the platforms for the gene expression platforms, the numbers of species where there are whole genomes that have been sequenced and publicly available. All of this, coupled with big data and AI, et cetera, holds promise to allow us to go from what appears to be this kind of impossibly entangled knot to a systematic approach to identifying pathways and then beginning to tell the evolutionary story of how these pathways came to be connected to one another, and in doing so, giving us a more illuminated understanding of the interconnection of physiology with pathophysiology.
Yeah, I think that's a wise approach. Molly and Athena, from your perspectives in life history theory and cancer, do you have any concrete examples of how this might be achieved, or things that we should be thinking about moving forward?
I have one example from cancer that I think is quite relevant here, which is, there are trade-offs with cancer susceptibility and other traits that are relevant to fitness, which is part of why cancer still exists, right? Because you would think, well, evolutionary, over evolutionary time, cancer would be eliminated because it kills organisms, but it's not. And that's because if you want to have a body that, for example, can heal a wound, then you need to have cells that can switch into a phenotypic state where they can proliferate, they can move to close a wound, and they can provide signals to the environment, the other cells around, that allow those things to happen. And so if you have the potential to switch into that genetic state, right, that epigenetic state, then that leads to a vulnerability where things can potentially sort of get into the sort of the wrong area of the landscape in terms of gene expression, and then you have susceptibility to cancer. So what this means is that it's really an information processing problem that needs to be solved at both the individual cellular level and then sort of the collective cellular communication level of, how do the cells and the collective of cells distinguish between, say, situations where it's a good thing for cells to be in a proliferative state and a motile state, and when that's not a good thing and that should be shut down. And that requires actually processing so many different signals in the environment, that the cells are in order to sort of distinguish between those states. So that's, I think there's a lot of potential, as we kind of start to understand these as issues of sort of, regulation and information processing, signal detection, of doing a better job of maybe nudging things back to a functional state once, they've perhaps gone in the wrong direction with cancer susceptibility.
Molly, how can complexity science approaches aid in the evaluation of life history traits, where we often think about mismatches, but this is sort of a different angle on approaching that question?
Yeah. And I would love to talk to about mismatches, later when the conversation moves that direction. But in terms of this idea of complexity systems, so life history is itself, a perspective that enables the, idea of integrating, a complex systems approach, because it's thinking about the lifespan in a larger integrated way, whereas a clinician will often look at one particular, what we call life history trait, say age at menarche or something, and try to, understand pathology in that arena. When an evolutionary scientist looks at age at menarche, we're looking at it in the context of the full lifespan, and the homeostatic forces that control not only that one trait, but that one trait that's connected to many different aspects of the shape of the lifespan. So life history traits are often treated by physicians without consideration of these homeostatic mechanisms that adaptively calibrate those traits. So for instance, how are we supposed to clinically address something like preterm birth without understanding the forces that govern the timing of birth, which is itself a very active area of research and something that's very poorly understood at this point from a biological perspective, and there's hot debate in that area. How are we supposed to clinically address something like premature puberty if we don't understand those homeostatic mechanisms that actually govern the timing of reproductive and social maturation? And these are things that are looked at not just in humans, but also across species. And we can gain a lot of insight there. And that's a lot of what Dr. Natterson-Horowitz's approach, looking, across phylogenies, is going to be really fruitful. My work is in both reproductive as well as aging science. And I think that's relevant here as well. How do we treat diseases of aging if we don't understand the basic processes that govern senescence? Because it's those homeostatic mechanisms that life history theory really highlights. And when those get either perturbed in a way that is genuinely pathological, that is, a very different question than when those homeostatic mechanisms actually result in an outcome that we don't like. That is not itself dysfunctional, that it's not itself pathological. And so from a life history perspective, we have to actually understand what's happening. Has there been some teratogenic exposure that has actually created a break in the system, or is the system working in a way that we're just not happy with?
So once we
I can also add that in terms of life history trade-offs, there are a lot with cancer in terms of fast growth, right? That can lead to susceptibility to cancer. That's a life history trait. Other aspects of reproductive competitiveness, things having to do with these sort of interactions with the placenta and resource transfer. So there's a lot of domains of connection with trade-offs with cancer and life history theory.
So Bernie, you're critical, but you're optimistic. How do we communicate this complexity? How do we transform the field in terms of and communicate to the public as well as practitioners that we need to be thinking about this in a more complex way? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I certainly think that there is some optimal combination of hope and fear when it comes to helping the field of evolutionary medicine move forward. As far as communicating the complexity to people, well, I'm not sure that is necessarily the way to go. There are plenty of straightforward examples of the uses of selection thinking and the uses of evolutionary medical perspectives, especially in areas like antibiotic resistance and the study of COVID and the treatment of cancer. In all of those cases, the system is very complex, but the foundational principles, when you get down to it, are the important ones are actually quite simple and easy for people to understand. The main hurdle to overcome is that they require thinking in terms of natural selection. And that's the key. Once you can get people doing that, there's a light bulb that goes on and people say, oh, this all makes sense now. And we have to turn that light on in more people.
I want to change the focus of the discussion a bit to mismatches in public health. So, I think this is a particularly good example where insights from an evolutionary approach and really an evolutionary ecological approach can scale up. mismatches between evolved physiological traits and life history traits in the current environment could help inform policies to address some of the most pressing public health challenges of our time. What are some key implications of these insights in public health policies? Any examples? Molly, do you want to have a stab at that at first? But I mean, I'd like to open it up to everybody.
I'm not sure I can speak to public health policy. I'm not a policy expert per se, but just in terms of maybe introducing some ideas related to mismatch and clinical research. There are two areas that I would want to just briefly mention. The first is that the area where one of the areas I work in is female reproductive life history, and this is an area that has seen arguably the most profound shift in human physiology across the evolutionary history of our species, where we have seen major changes in everything from age at menarche to the timing of births, the intervals between births, but very importantly, the total number of births that women experience in a lifetime and the total duration of time they spend breastfeeding. So if you think about the cumulative biological impact of spending on, say, average years and years and years of your life in a physiological state of lactation versus in contemporary industrialized Western populations where women spend 0 to maybe a couple months of their life in that physiological state, the cumulative biological impact across your lifespan on your physiology and health can be really profound. And as we look to the future, we see these major demographic changes happening globally, right? And one of them is the drop in fertility, the number of live births that a woman on average has, as well as the skyrocketing frequency of having no pregnancies at all in your lifetime. And I'm not making any value judgment about whether this is good or bad, but we need to be prepared for the change to our public health framework to prepare for populations that are going through their life and aging with a very different physiology that they're bringing to old age. So some of the work in my lab and many others as well looks at how these reproductive events reorganize female physiological systems, and in the absence of this reorganization, what do we expect female physiology to look like across the lifespan, and how does that affect disease risk? And then the other major area where I'm quite interested in how mismatch can have these profound physiological effects is in the microbiome, because there's a multi-million year evolutionary history of mammals co-evolving with microorganisms that live in and on our bodies, and this predates primates, it predates hominins, it predates the emergence of our species. And of course, our species is just a small part of this long evolutionary history. And so the way that we grow and develop has always been in concert with these resident microbes. And over the last few hundred to few thousand years, we've seen these really major changes in the populations of microorganisms that live in and on our bodies. First with, say, the agricultural revolution about starting maybe 12,000 years ago. But then a major shift happened then with the Industrial Revolution starting 250 years ago. And so the sort of loss of diversity and the rise of pathogenic microbes has really changed the way that these microorganisms educate our immune system and work in concert with our digestion, our brains, and have really seemingly been implicated in almost every physiological process. So.
Anyone else want to add any insights into mismatches? Barb?
Yeah. Oh, I think Randy has one too. Well, I just want to add that evolutionary medicine there's an opportunity also to think about phenotypic flexibility. So we are not the first species to encounter a suddenly changed environment, right? The part of the history of life on Earth are those kinds of experiences. And so the advantage of having a flexible phenotype is real. And I think one opportunity is to turn to other species turning to other species is one of the ways to understand in what ways and why can certain animals become more flexible in terms of the physiology that they have. So this kind of moving away from a fixed to a rather kind of recognizing how dynamic physiology is, something which I think we physicians sometimes underestimate just how dynamic an individual's physiology can be, and as a consequence, how it may be dialed up, that flexibility could be dialed up to decrease the misalignment between the phenotype and the environment.
Randy?
So my comment is just how pathetic it is that we haven't followed up on many of these things with mainstream medical research. We know that nearsightedness is many times higher than it ever was before. We know that autoimmune diseases are epidemic and allergies are too, to say nothing of heart disease. And we still don't know for sure what it is about modern environments that do these things. This should be, multi-million-dollar crass research efforts, because that would do more good for human health than all the work we're doing now about mechanisms. Conversely, a lot of the research being done about, autoimmune diseases and it's looking for the bad genes as if they are bad genes. And turns out that most of the genes that are being found that cause chronic diseases are perfectly fine in ancestral environments. And they only become pathological in modern environments. And we've got to get people away from the simplistic thinking that these are bad genes. They're just neutral genes until they get in modern environments, leading to fundamental misconceptions about the causes of disease.
Yeah, excellent points. And I think what, a theme of this is, and the theme of these papers and these discussions are, we need to create more collaborations. We need more interdisciplinary and intersectional approaches. How do we create this sort of a moonshot project? And is this a moonshot project similar to the Human Genome Project, for example? Anybody?
Well, I think it's an inside out rather than an outside in strategy. And I think that's kind of what we're doing, in the sense that if you look at the membership of the International Society for Evolutionary Medicine and Public Health, I mean, we've got a diversity of fields represented, and there are more that should be represented. And so because if nothing in biology makes sense outside the light of evolution, then actually every field of biomedical investigation really is already part of our evolutionary medicine community, but they don't know it. And so one strategy is just to kind of really begin working from the inside out, field by field. It's a little bit of man-to-man combat or woman-to-woman combat, in the sense that it's having conversations, collaborating with folks from different disciplines, reaching out. And that's, I think many of us who are very involved in evolutionary medicine, that's exactly what we're doing.
I'd like to add that I think that if we have opportunities for sort of semi-structured events where people are able to have some creativity, share lots of ideas in a sort of parallel kind of way, and then have some mechanisms for sort of following up, that's a great way to find new connections and opportunities that you might not be able to find if you didn't have like a little bit more sort of room to explore.
So let's think about the evolution of evolutionary medicine itself. And Bernie, in your Viewpoint article, you wrote, the greatest strength of evolutionary medicine is relentless interdisciplinarity. It appears to be its greatest vulnerability. You propose that the pathway between evolutionary theory and clinical adaptations has three great divides. If we could bring that image up and share it with everyone. Could you talk us through these and your suggested solutions between theory and empirical evidence from academics, between academia as a whole, and the domains of medicine as a whole, and between the academic and medical researchers and the clinicians who actually see patients to conduct trials of these therapies? And I think the point is that, these discussions that Athena alluded to, this interdisciplinarity, I think it needs to have a strong structure. And I think, Bernie's, illustration here really provides one frame on that structure, and it's a structure of application. And I think we should never lose our thoughts on this. So I'll just shut up and let Bernie go on from here.
Thanks, Dan. Of the three divides, the one on the left is between empiricists and empirical biologists. That evolution is inherently mathematical and statistical, and most empirical biologists are not. So the idea here is to seek to encourage closer associations between more mathematically inclined and empirically inclined people within evolutionary biology. And that can be done, I think, in straightforward ways by motivating editors, PhD advisors, and PIs to compel people to make these connections in their work. The second divide is the tallest for a reason. This is between evolutionary medical biologists and medical doctors. And the reason it's so big is because people in these two groups, they think differently at a very fundamental level, and they have very different bodies of knowledge. So in evolution, we think about ultimate mechanisms and the why questions and variation in populations and selection. That's all great. We don't know medicine. We don't know enough about specialized areas of medicine usually in order to apply that knowledge to those areas. It is extremely difficult to gain the sophisticated, detailed knowledge that one needs to actually move into such highly developed fields. On the other hand, the medical community and doctors, they think in terms of diagnoses and how questions, proximate mechanisms, biomarkers, best practices. They know medicine, they know the detail, they don't know evolutionary biology. So how do you bring these together? Well, an obvious approach would be education. When do you educate? Do you educate in medical school? Is that too late? Can you squeeze it in there to a full curriculum? Do you educate to undergraduates in universities? There's probably hundreds of evolutionary medical courses that are doing this, and I think that this is an excellent approach. But can one go even younger? Is there a critical period for younger people to learn about evolution and natural selection in particular? And I think that's an open question. The third divide is between evolutionary-minded researchers and industry, and this brings in business and economics and big pharma. And I also noticed that it also brings in public policy. So you've got three groups here. You've got evolutionary medical people, you've got doctors, and you've got business. Three worlds are colliding, and that makes it inherently difficult. And one needs people who are trained and have enough knowledge to connect those three. The motivation there is money, and that should work to the extent that evolutionary medicine can provide the applications that can be turned into therapies and into public policies that have payoffs that are both economic and with regard to well-being. So I think these are big challenges. I think the main goal now is to think about, well, what really are the best ways of overcoming them in terms of what can we do now, what is practical now, what institutions can we approach, can we get NSF and NIH to come together to create moonshot programs that focus on especially the middle divide. It's all hopeful and possible, but one can also fear because it is all a very big challenge.
Well, but it's also sort of the Jackson Pollock model. It's complex, and we need to be doing many things at the same time. And I think this offer some sort of a roadmap for that. So with this, I think it's time to move to the questions, and I think Lee's going to help us with those questions from the audience. Thanks everybody for your thoughts, and looking forward to we'll be answering these questions as Lee suggests some to answer.
Great, thanks, Dan. We have had a great many questions coming in. Dental health, not often discussed in this, hasn't been discussed in this context. How could dental health fit into this notion of evolutionary medicine? This is from Wench Bornacker. The fact that people previously people did not live long enough to lose teeth owing to periodontitis. But are there consequences in improvements, if you like, in longevity with respect to dental health and other outputs like diet, therefore, and eating behaviors?
First of all, thank you for this question. And at the International Society for Evolutionary Medicine and Public Health, we have had some very interesting and insightful talks from dental health researchers. So this is an area that does exist in our field and in our society. I've been interested in oronasal inflammation and oronasal health because, first of all, this is potentially a great area of what we call evolutionary mismatch, with enormously changed air pollution, for instance, as well as our diets that now cause periodontal disease in ways that are also probably novel with the introduction of refined sugar and processed foods. And so at least arguably the oronasal microbiome as well as the immune environment of the oronasal cavity would be quite different than it would have been throughout the vast majority of human evolutionary history. And of course, the olfactory nerves provide a sort of superhighway from whatever's happening in this part of the head into the brain. And so some of our work in Alzheimer's disease has been interested in the possibility that the the massive amount of air pollution that we now see, as well as the high rates of periodontal disease, could contribute to evolutionarily novel rates of Alzheimer's. And now, because I've mentioned Alzheimer's, and in your question, you talked about the fact that people didn't used to live quite so long, that is and isn't true. We have no time machine to go back, in history and see exactly who lived how long. But work from a few different areas does tell us a little bit about the evolutionary history of the length of the human lifespan. There is life history research that looks at that, but also we can look at people who live in small-scale societies today. And over the last few decades, there has been research in these small-scale societies, especially those that practice hunting and gathering lifestyles that more closely, but not perfectly, resemble the lifestyles of all people before the agricultural revolution. And what we do see is that in those small-scale societies, so there are super high rates of infant and early childhood mortality. And those somewhat distort our idea of the length of the human lifespan, or how long people are living, because they have an undue mathematical influence on the average age of the lifespan when you have a lot of people whose lifespan is 3 months or 1 year or so, right? So once you make it to age 16, so once you've survived this early sort of difficult and dangerous phase of life in small-scale societies, when you look across several of them in a very important review paper by Gervin and Kaplan, what they found was that the modal age at adult death, so death after age 16, was actually in your 70s. And about a quarter to a third of all adult deaths occurred after that age. So the idea that having individuals who are of older ages is novel is something that I would somewhat argue against. Yes, there have been expansions that have gone a few years longer than that. And when you look at the average age of death in a place like Japan, it's going to be, pretty evolutionarily novel. But the idea that we didn't have people living into their 70s and maybe even early 80s is, I would say, not quite right. When you look at the Hadza hunter-gatherers of Tanzania, about a third of women at any given time are postmenopausal. So these are parts of the lifespan that I think we really do need to understand from an evolutionary medicine point of view. And I won't go too much into this, but an area of major interest to me is the idea that humans have evolved an adaptive strategy where families are interdependent, and grandparents, especially grandmothers, play a role in this interdependence that has allowed the evolution of human females to have short interbirth intervals and large numbers of children who remained juvenile dependent for many, many years. And so in order to really understand diseases of aging, I think we have to look at it in the context of interdependent families, where even those who are post their own reproductive phase of life are actually part of this adaptive model. I'll let someone else speak about these other things. We can circle back about epigenetics if needed.
I just want to hit a point about the dental and sort of evolutionary medicine and dentistry. There's a book by Sandra Kahn and Paul Ehrlich that talks about how our jaws are getting smaller because we're not eating hard foods, and builds a case that modern orthodontics is actually causing all sorts of respiratory problems and health problems that follow. So people are, thinking about this. In the book Jaws, the story of a hidden epidemic, an interesting and insightful read. Randy, looks like you have a comment.
Just quick comments about dental is a huge opportunity here. There are a couple of people working in this area, but many more would be welcome. I think the most interesting lecture opportunity I ever had was for the Royal College of Periodontics. They were all interested in evolutionary. So I had learned something about periodontics. Did you ever think about it? Between your tooth and the gum is a great place for bacteria to grow. And it's just astounding that it's possible to control that bacterial growth, but it requires very active immune surveillance in that area, which is also going to possibly damage the gums. So there's a trade-off intrinsic to that intrinsically vulnerable system. Another thing that came up during that learning for giving that talk, strep mutans, which is the cause of cavities, really didn't get going until 10,000 years ago, once we started raising grains and having the opportunity for sugars. And you can trace through genomic studies the rise of strep mutans and its ability to create acid, to create little niches for itself in our teeth. So there's just, again, a gigantic opportunity is ready and waiting for people who are interested in this area.
Yeah, I mean, dental, if I can just add, I mean, Christina Warner and her group, I mean, looking at, reconstructing the oral microbiomes of ancient humans. So there's a lot of activity around just looking at ancient plaque, and so much of evolutionary medicine is actually revealed in dental health, from mismatch to, trade-offs to evolutionary byproduct. So, yes.
Well, we'll move on to a question from Catherine. I've had a couple of questions which are sort of touching on the bringing in of complexity science. One from Catherine: what is the role that AI is playing in embracing complexity? How is it being leveraged to better understand evolutionary medicine processes? And also another question from Psycat: how should collaboration, or how could collaboration be useful with engineers and applied physicists, particularly with respect to computational modeling of microscale processes?
I think that collaboration with people who are experts in engineering and modeling is a really key aspect of understanding, any systems where you do have regulatory mechanisms. Now, I think there's also, as sort of Randy was alluding to and others, you can go a little bit too far sometimes with sort of thinking of everything in terms of just a sort of engineering kind of metaphor, because some things, they don't necessarily sort of fit an input-output model. But the thing is, once you start having sort of, like the control systems approach, it's right about having thresholds for responding. You have feedback, you have lots of different, entities that are potentially engaging in this information processing, changing their states in response to each other. That's when you start to get things that, they may actually have a computational underpinning that we can model, but you have to be able to sort of take that decentralized approach and say, okay, these things may be doing computation on these smaller levels. And then that is leading to these aggregate effects that might be hard to sort of look at with a macro engineering perspective, even though at the very, very micro level, where we might not even be able to really say exactly what's going on just because the methods are challenging, we may have, mechanisms that really do follow these sort of control systems engineering kind of principles.
It could be employed. I mean, its strengths are to deal with levels of complexity that the human brain has not evolved to deal with. So there's a real complementarity there. The trick would be to provide an AI with some sort of conceptual framework or filter, train it in concepts of evolutionary biology and evolutionary medicine, perhaps, so that it can use its ability to handle systems that the human brain cannot.
I think one of the challenges of AI is having the diverse training sets that are going to be necessary to allow its potential to be not restricted to, white men from, developed countries. And I think this is a recognized challenge of machine learning in general and AI in general. And some of the broader scale collaborations that we're calling for, and one of the things that's quite exciting from looking at our audience is people are from all over and will be contributing data and can be contributing data to create these sort of moonshot type databases that can be mined in an intelligent way. AI won't necessarily give us the mechanisms, but it might identify patterns that can be interrogated for mechanisms. So I think AI is has upsides and downsides, but clearly it's a tool that needs to be used in the future.
I think AI gives us a wonderful comparison with how the human brain and all control systems and organisms are shaped. They're shaped by essentially the same thing as machine learning. And the key to that is that you can't tell how an AI does its job, and it does it a little differently every time. And this is why our attempts to figure out the wiring system of the brain or computer programs of the brain aren't working, because they're not like something designed by someone. They're essentially AIs or machine learning products, which are very different in their structure.
Yeah, great insight.
Actually, Dan, you brought up the question there of diversity, and that brings us to another question. This is from Alicia. Can you comment on the fact that there are major differences in the way people live, work, reproduce in the global north and global south, and how this affects evolutionary medicine in each part of the world? And there was another question also relating to the genetic diversity as well between different populations. So I guess the broad question, how is evolutionary medicine evolving the field? How is work progressing? How is it dealing with the differences between the different parts of the world and differences genetically and life history traits and so forth?
So we should at least let people know that Jay Labov has, on behalf of the society, has put in a very large grant proposal for increasing diversity in evolutionary medicine worldwide. In terms of sexual differences and racial differences, and bringing in people from all over the world who otherwise don't get an opportunity. Many people are fascinated and they can't get to meetings, or they don't have access to journals and the like. And I sure hope that grant submission is funded.
There is an evolutionary medicine seminar series called Club EvMed, and we're right in the middle of a series of the applications of evolutionary medicine to health inequalities, which tend to be direct consequences of economic and societal inequalities. So there are very strong interfaces that are just emerging, and this whole field is growing rapidly within evolutionary biology. And in particular, how can this field be useful and applied to the particular problems that come about in variation in health inequalities that where many of the mechanisms involved and the processes involved have clear evolutionary bases.
Sorry, Molly.
Yeah, just to sort of address this question, we can also think about the science of diversity itself, and that evolutionary medicine actually does what I think is a phenomenal job compared to, more traditional biomedical research disciplines of actually investigating the science of human diversity. And, part of that is the integration of biological anthropologists who work globally in places that don't always fall under what we sometimes call the weird category, which stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic nations. So the, when you read biomedical studies and they talk about something being translatable across multiple groups, or a widely diverse study that had this wonderful replicability, often what you see is that these are in different racial or ethnic groups within one of these weird countries, which from a global perspective is not really embracing the full diversity of humanity, or something that was replicated in 2 European and 1 North American nation. And again, this is really not what we think of as diversity from an anthropological perspective. I mean, it's some diversity, but this is, the expanse of human diversity is much greater than this. So actually bringing in evolutionary scientists is a great way to contribute to understanding this. And, an example of this comes from work that came from Peter Ellison at Harvard a long time ago, probably before it would even have been considered evolutionary medicine, which was the observation that testosterone and other steroid hormone levels were substantially lower at basal levels in the Ache hunter-gatherers, I think was who he was looking at, in Paraguay, compared to the standard Boston fertility clinic expectations. And by their expectations, every single member of that community should have been infertile. But of course they were not. And so the understanding of how evolution and life history theory and biology actually shape and control human physiology is much broader than looking at any one population. And to actually understand a medical topic like, for instance, male fertility, we actually need to have a better scientific understanding of what's happening.
Can I just add that in the 21st century, one of the significant factors that it's going to be shaping differences in human health across the world is the impact of climate change and the associated forms of ecological degradation. And here another opportunity through evolutionary medicine, which acknowledges, that our shared ancestry includes shared vulnerability to environmental effects. And so I'm actually heartened that in the past couple of years, there is an increased interest in tracking animal health, not just because we want to prevent the next pandemic, but of course we do, but to track animal health for some of the effects of climate change and air pollution, the health of the cardiovascular health, the pulmonary health, the reproductive health of non-human animals living in and around communities where individuals, human and non-human, are being affected by these shared environmental effects. So I think that when we talk about the northern and southern hemisphere, and we're talking about differential health patterns, I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind that there is this opportunity to have greater insight into the effect of the environment on human health by paying attention to the non-human animals with whom we are sharing the environment.
I think it's time to wrap up. I think there are many more questions that we can't get to, but I'd like to thank everyone for submitting them. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for what turned out to be a pretty stimulating conversation, and for Frontiers for having the vision to sort of promote this. I continually am amazed by the professionalism and support of the staff who've helped us put this together. So I think all of us are grateful for their help. I hope you'll all join us in recognizing our excitement of the potential of evolutionary medicine to transform public health and medicine and recognize some of the challenges we face moving forward. Our goal here was to begin discussing some of these challenges, but really to get you thinking about this as a process. This isn't an answer. This is a process, and this hopefully will be a successful process that will continue over time. It's taken us decades to get to this point where we can have such a compelling discussion. I've been following evolutionary medicine since Randy and George's initial paper and been puzzled about why isn't it taking off? These are such great ideas. And in part because of Randy and Steve's and other people's leadership, it is taking off. And I think we're really at a really productive stage right now. I think we have to constantly think about how this information can be applied. I think the challenge is translation. And I think that just as exciting as it is to come up with interesting functional explanations and mechanistic explanations that highlight the diversity of mechanisms leading to vulnerabilities and shared vulnerabilities, I think that we must always think about how we translate those. And I think that bringing more physicians involved in these sorts of processes and these collaborations will be important, because they're going to ask the village idiot questions. They're going to say, great, how's it going to help me translate? How's it going to help me improve the health and well-being of my patients? Having Randy on board and sharing his insights, and Bernie his critical insights, I think has been incredibly productive in this discussion. I think that the systematic mapping of disease traits may involve new collaborations and the construction of databases that currently don't exist, and these create a series of organizational challenges that we only touched on briefly, but we talk about in our paper a bit more. Resistance is futile. Resistance is generally expected and creates a huge challenge for all drug therapies. And I think great progress has been made in addressing this, but much more needs to be made to think about how we develop resistance-proof therapies. And it's not one answer; it's multiple approaches together. Evolutionary medicine isn't a simple pill. It's a complex tapestry of an approach that needs to be applied, more broadly. So, this leads us to the insights of the related fields of One Health, and I'd like to give Barb a brief last word to sort of, think about how she views this. So, thanks everybody for joining us.
Yeah, first, I just want to echo Dan's gratitude to all the people involved in this wonderful seminar. Yes, well, One Health and planetary health, these are fields really that are emerging through the recognition that the health of humans and animals and the planet that we share, that there's this interdependence. And I would argue that because of this interdependence, the why for this interdependence is shared evolutionary ancestry, and shared vulnerability to the environment, and shared evolutionary processes that have shaped the multitudes of phenotypes that we find on Earth. So what I thought I would do to close things out was to share two thoughts from two of my my scientific heroes. And each of these thoughts focuses on what I consider to be one of the two central promises of evolutionary medicine. First, from Rachel Carson, who of course launched the modern environmental movement with the publication of Silent Spring in 1962. She said, "In nature, nothing exists alone." And I think when we look at our human vulnerability to disease and the vulnerability of non-human animals to disease and the health of our planet, this is really embodies an evolutionary medicine perspective. And the other, of course, is the promise of evolutionary medicine to accelerate biomedical innovation by recognizing that we humans are not the only animals on the planet, that the evolved adaptations, the evolutionary processes that have produced adaptations in non-human animals and non-animal forms of life may contain physiologies and strategies that can be once perceived, brought back to human health as a source of at least inspiration and possibly even a blueprints for innovation. And I don't think there's anyone who described the power of evolution to produce solutions than Charles Darwin, who wrote in The Origin of Species, "Natural selection is a power incessantly ready for action and I love this next part, immeasurably superior to man's feeble efforts." So with that, I'd like to thank everyone involved, and and this is a wonderful seminar. Thank you so much.
Just to say thanks to Barbara, to Dan, for Randy, to Athena, Molly, and Bernard for a wonderful, wonderful session. Most of all, thank you to you all for attending. Please do visit Frontiers in Science to the Evolutionary Medicine Hub, where you can read the article. You can continue the conversation on social media. Frontiers Forum is the hashtag. You can subscribe to our newsletter at the Frontiers in Science website. In the meantime, thanks for joining again, and goodbye.